Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and today we're going to take a look at the Drop Plus THX AAA 1 linear amplifier. This is a headphone amp with a really kind of excessively long name. But anyway, Drop sent this to me about a month ago, and I've been using it as kind of my main headphone amplifier along my Schiit Vali 2, and really just trying to get a feel for this amplifier. So what this is, and maybe a little bit of background on why this is an interesting amplifier. I think it was back in 2018, Drop came out with the THX AAA 789, which is an all-balanced headphone amplifier. I think it cost around $300. And that headphone amplifier got a lot of interest. The people that are into objective measurements of headphone amplifiers seem to think that the 789 does pretty good for its price. And this is kind of like a budget version of that amp. So the AAA 1, maybe I'll just call it the 1, the AAA 1, this is a $200 amp. So still not super cheap, but actually still in sort of the low end range of headphone amplifiers. And it's still got the THX magic, I suppose, and it's ostensibly still got really nice measurements. I'll be honest though, I didn't do any measurements myself. But what's the compromise for the $200, right? It's $100 cheaper than the 789. The main difference is that this is not a balanced headphone amplifier. And we'll get into a little bit more detail about the differences, but yeah, this is not a balanced headphone amplifier. This is just a single-ended. And for me, I actually don't care that it's not balanced. In fact, I probably prefer it. Anyway, I think I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So in this review, I'll start by talking about, the physical aspects of this headphone amplifier. Spoiler, it's a metal box. And then I'll give you some notes on what it was like to live with this for the past month and do some comparisons between this and the Schiit Vali, as well as the JDS Atom. And then at the end, I'll give it a little score, and you'll know how much I like or don't like this headphone amplifier. So this is a live review. If you're watching now and you've got any questions about this or anything else that we're talking about, feel free to leave it in the live chat. And at the end of the video, we'll have a little back and forth conversation, and hopefully I can answer your questions. But if you're watching and it's not live now, you missed out, and that's okay. It's kind of late on a Sunday evening. But subscribe to the channel and ding the YouTube bell so that YouTube lets you know next time I'm live, and then we can have a little chat. But for now, let's dive into the details of the Drop THX AAA 1 linear amplifier, which, as I promised, this is a metal box. I'll start just by talking about what sorts of things are that come with this, and there's frankly not a lot, which is pretty typical of headphone amplifiers. You get the box itself. Looks nice, right? You get a wall wart power adapter, so the power plugs in back here, and there is a separate power brick that will plug into your wall. I don't have it here with me because I thought it'd be a pain in the butt to pull out, but use your imagination. It's about average size. You also do get, interestingly, a little carrying bag, which, I don't think I'm gonna carry my headphone amplifier anywhere with me, but this is actually kind of a nice little cloth bag with a little Drop logo on it that I might use for carrying around headphones afterward. So that's the extent of what you get inside the box of this amplifier, but let's go ahead and dig in a little bit more into detail about the actual hardware here. So like I mentioned earlier, this is an all metal box. I can't find any plastic, frankly, on the exterior of this. There are rubberized feet, which is nice because that holds this thing relatively in place, and it's got a fair amount of heft to it. It's heavy enough that when using this thing normally, turning the dials and stuff like that, the headphone amplifier doesn't move around, which is pretty nice. Although it's not quite heavy enough that when inserting and pulling out the headphone jack, I'm just gonna have to emulate it here, it will still move around a little bit. So I do find myself like reaching up, grabbing it, and then inserting and removing the headphone jack. Let's talk about I/O real quick. Now, on the back here, you can tell this is a very simple headphone amplifier. Not a lot of features here in the THX 1. You've got your input, your output, your preamp output, and you've got a power connector. So the input, ostensibly, you're going to connect an external DAC or something to this. And the drop, if you're just getting to headphone amplifiers and you're not, you know, super up on this stuff, the drop THX AAA 1 does not come with a DAC. You're gonna have to supply that yourself separately. I personally already owned a Schiit Modi 3. Yeah, it's a Modi 3. So that was what I used with the drop THX 1. But yeah, you're gonna have to find your own. Maybe this is actually a good point for me to point out that unfortunately, Drop doesn't seem to sell any DACs that come in this same form factor. They've got a handful of different DACs that they do provide and make available, and they're black and they look kind of similar, but they're kind of a lot smaller. They don't seem like they would stack necessarily perfectly if that's your thing, and I'll be honest, it's kind of my thing. So that's a little bit of a bummer, but otherwise, I mean, the box is pretty handsome. Let's talk about the front of this thing, and I apologize that it's out of focus, I know, but I feel like this is probably easier than refocusing it. We do have that single-ended 1/4-inch headphone jack that I alluded to, no balanced output on this thing. You've got your power switch over here, which is sort of a standard push in, push out. You've got your gain switch, which has actually 3 settings, which is kind of cool. A lot of headphone amplifiers only have low and high. This thing's got low, medium, and high, which is cool because that gives you a little bit more flexibility with the throw of the volume knob, right? Let's say you're listening to a sensitive IM or something on a powerful headphone amplifier like this. If you only had high gain, right? If this thing was only had one mode, the volume knob would just be really, really sensitive, where you would have very little range that you could actually use your sensitive earphones. Having different volume gain stages lets you go to low gain and just get more use out of that volume knob. And then having 3 stages just gives you even that much more resolution. In fact, I found myself typically using stage 1 for IMs. Stage 2 I was using for headphones, like some COS 60 ohm headphones that I was using. And then stage 3 is pretty good for, well, any other, you know, like 300 ohm headphones. I was using mostly my Sennheiser HD 600s as per typical. You get, of course, a volume knob, and it's a pretty decent little volume knob. It's not, you know, it's not as buttery smooth as you might expect on a more expensive amp, but I really have no complaints about this knob. It's generally got, you know, consistent throw, and it's got plenty of travel. You can see this is at minimum volume, and this is at maximum volume. So about 300 degrees of travel. And then finally, you get a button for toggling on and off the preamp out. And basically what that is I did show this, the preamp out on the back of this device. Basically, you could connect this thing to a set of speakers or something else externally. And rather than having the audio coming out of the headphone jack, you can hit this button and it will come out the back of the device and go into whatever it is that you've got it connected to. It was interesting, just a quick note, like I actually liked having a button for that. Some other amps, and this is, I think, an example, the Atom, and my Schiit definitely works this way. There's no button for switching between the headphone jack and the pre-out. You just have to remove the headphone, which means that if I want to have the audio from this go out to speakers, I have to unplug my headphones. I actually like that the Drop 1 doesn't force you to do that. Okay, is that enough? Is that everything I need to talk about, the physical aspects of this thing? I think it is. Let me check my notes. Yeah, I said the good knob feel. I mean, maybe worth pointing out too is that all of these touch points appear to be metal, which is nice. Yeah, it's just a really, you know, it's a hefty feeling piece of hardware. And especially compared here to the JDS Atom. You can see, like, size-wise, the THX 1 is not the smallest amplifier. The Atom is actually pretty compact, but one of the reasons I don't love this amplifier too much, even though, you know, it's a very well-regarded amp, is it's just lightweight and plastic and it feels kind of cheap. The Drop THX 1 have no issues with that whatsoever. All right, let's go ahead and now talk about just sort of like the functionality and the sound of this thing. And I'll start actually with a little bit of specs. I mentioned up front that this is sort of the little brother, the cheaper brother of the THX 789. And one of the big differences between this and that is obviously the single-ended output versus the balanced output. And with that comes a pretty big difference in terms of power output capabilities. The 789, I believe, has got like 6,000 milliwatts of power, which is kind of ridiculous. That's 6,000 milliwatts at 32 ohms. This has got 2,700 milliwatts, which might sound like, wow, that's less than half of the other one, but that's actually still a lot of power. So for example, this JDS Atom, I believe, has only got 1,000 milliwatts, so 1 amp or 1 watt of power, where this is 2.7 watts of power, quite a bit more. And then as well, this is actually an interesting comparison between this and the 789, is the 789 on single-ended output only has 1,800 milliwatts. So this is 2,700 milliwatts on single-ended versus 1,800. So basically, this is more powerful than the more expensive 789 if you're using single-ended. And me personally, I don't have any I don't think I have any balanced headphones. I guess, I don't know, maybe it's like some, I got some, 3.5 or 2.5 millimeter, 4.4 millimeter, mostly IEMs that I have some balanced stuff, but I'm just really not a balanced guy. When I'm using an amplifier like this, I'm using my headphones, and there I don't really care about balanced. So for me, this is actually, I think, the more sensible setup than the 789. Now, if you want balanced, you're gonna have to you have to spend more and get that, but for me, I'm actually pretty happy with that. And then in terms of the power output and like actual capabilities, like I mentioned, it's got the 3 different stages of gain. Just for reference, this thing, the most demanding stuff that I've got is Sennheiser HT600s and HiFiMan Sidaras. They are not the most demanding headphones, but they definitely, I think, work better on an amplifier. And using them here on the THX1, I would leave this thing in high gain. And for the Sennheisers, I would have the volume knob right about there, right? So like I'd have the volume knob at about 25% power, which leaves this much headroom for me to really just blast my ears off, which straight up, I did not try. I recommend you not try to blast your ears off, but if you're using headphones that need more power than the Sennheiser HT600s, I think this is going to do a pretty good job. Now, again, I didn't test it against anything more demanding than those, but just to give you that sense, 25% power at gain level 3. I think this thing is going to have more power, more than enough power for anything I can throw at it. Anything else to talk about before we get into what this thing sounds like? Let's see, a couple notes is this thing does take about a second or two, maybe 2 seconds to warm up when you first turn this thing on, which just means that you hit the power switch on this thing and about 1 or 2 seconds later, audio will then start coming out of it. So it's not instant, but it is actually quite a bit faster than my Schiit Vali, which I guess makes sense. That's a tube amplifier versus this solid state. And then another note on the power actually is that the one has actually got sort of an auto power off mode that I thought could be pretty annoying, but in practice, I actually like a lot. Basically, just when you unplug your headphones, this thing will kind of go into a sleep mode on its own, or if you just don't use, if no audio is going into and out of this thing for a set number of minutes, this thing will then go into sort of a sleep mode. And then when you do start pumping audio into it, it will automatically turn itself back on. You can kind of hear a little click that indicates that that's happening. And I actually found that pretty convenient because I'm lazy and I'm forgetful, and I will leave the power switch on this thing on. And here with the one, it's actually not a problem. Whereas with my Valley, that thing gets hot. It doesn't have auto power off, auto sleep modes and stuff like that. So I have to be pretty cautious and remember to turn that thing off. But here with the drop, no concerns with that. And in fact, even just on the topic of heat, this thing maybe gets a little bit warm after a really long day of listening, but for the most part, this thing stays pretty cool. Okay, let's talk about sound. And unfortunately, I'm not gonna have a lot to say about sound because this will be like a little interlude here. Headphone amplifiers for the most part sound mostly the same to me, and like I'm gonna describe some differences because there are some differences that I think I hear between this and some of the other amplifiers that I'm comparing it to, but my general take is that if you want to change the sound in your system, the headphone amplifier and the DAC are pretty low on the chain in terms of impact. But for me, like when I'm getting a headphone amplifier, what I want is enough power, I want no noise floor, and I just kind of want a neutral sound signature generally. And I'll say it just up front, I think that's what the THX 1 delivers. This is, to my ear, a very neutral sounding headphone amplifier. Very, very clean. I had zero noise, zero issues with hiss. In fact, even with sensitive IEMs, I had zero hiss, which is pretty cool. But yeah, it's just clean, very black background, and somewhat sharp in the details. On the topic of IEMs, before we jump into comparisons, I actually should call out the output impedance on this is actually really low, which is good. It's 0.01 ohms, at least according to the spec sheet. That just means that you're not going to have to worry about this thing adding any coloration to balanced armature IEMs and stuff like that. Like I mentioned, it's dead silent on even my most sensitive IEMs, assuming I'm in the low gain stage. If I crank the volume, I can elicit a little bit of noise floor out of the THX 1. But that's at volume levels that I would seriously be concerned for my hearing if I accidentally hit the play button when I was testing that. So no issues with hiss here as far as I'm concerned. The one oddity worth pointing out is that this thing seems to output a little bit of audio even at zero volume setting. And so if I have this thing at gain stage 1 and the volume all the way down, and I have this thing plugged into my most sensitive IEMs, I can hear the faintest hint of music coming out of, well, I guess it's not coming out of there, it's going into my earphones. But that was interesting. And it was the same thing if I had this thing in gain stage 3 with my Sennheisers connected. I could hear just the faintest amount of sound coming through it, which is curious. Obviously, you could power it off and not have to worry about that. But in fact, I'm not even worried about it as is, but it was worth calling out. Okay, now let's talk about some sound comparisons. Like I mentioned, I compared the one with this here, which is the JDS Atom, as well as my Schiit Vali 2, which I'm not going to pull out because that's still kind of affixed to my desk. But let's start with this thing. So just right off the bat, like specs wise, this thing is quite a bit more powerful than the Atom. This thing is about, I think I maybe already mentioned it. This has got 1,000 milliwatts of power, so 1 watt of power at 32 ohms, again, versus 2,700. So almost 3 times more powerful, which is kind of cool. But otherwise, honestly, I had a pretty hard time hearing much of a difference between these two. I know that this is sort of an objectivist friendly amplifier. It measures very well, low, harmonic distortion, low noise, etc., etc. And yeah, I think when you're dealing with the solid state amps that kind of are aiming for those same targets, they're gonna mostly sound basically the same. Now that said, I'm gonna say some things that I could be kidding myself on. I'll be just totally upfront. But I did perceive a slightly blacker background here with the Drop 1 and slightly sharper transient edges, okay? Again, I could be tricking myself, but I did sort of a little blind A/B setup that I have, and that was a slight difference that I was able to identify, consistently in a number of those blind A/B tests. Is it a big enough difference that I would pick this over that just for the sound? In my opinion, no. I think the power output and the build quality are going to be the bigger differentiators for this thing. But, if I'm trying to call out differences in these things, that is how I would describe them. Both very neutral, both very clean, slightly blacker background here on the Drop. Okay, and now comparisons versus the Schiit Vali, which again, I'm not going to pull in. I'm not going to pull into frame, but that one has, I believe, 1,500 milliwatts of power at 32 ohms. So a little bit more powerful than the JDS, but still only about half as powerful as the Drop 1. Still, it's more than enough power for the headphones that I throw at it, but there you go. And then between this and the Vali, there is actually more audible sound differences. And these I'm less worried about being placebo because these are fairly obvious to me. I mean, when I say fairly obvious, look, most amps still, even solid state to a tube amplifier like the Vali, the difference, don't expect huge differences. But if you're into this hobby and you're like listening, you know your headphone really, really well, and then you start hooking up to different sources, that's when you can start picking out the differences. And I would say that the Vali 2 almost kind of has like a more open stage, a little bit more of a 3D effect to the sound. I think the treble, like the lower treble on the Vali 2 might be a little bit pulled back or just a little bit softer versus the sharp edges here of the THX 1. But yeah, it was just kind of like a difference in the presentation of the sound, like that stage effect that I described of the Vali. Another way to describe it is it almost just sounds like there's, you know, tangible air between the different sounds and the different layers in the instruments. Whereas here, it just sounds like a super black background. So in between the instruments, it's just more like the absence of air, just kind of like a vacuum. And that effect can make this sound a little bit narrower, I suppose, versus the Vali. But I think probably this is just the more neutral headphone amplifier. So, I mean, that's about as much as I can tell you, at least off the top of my head, about the THX, the Drop plus THX AAA 1 linear headphone amplifier. So out of 5 stars, I'm gonna go ahead and just give this thing 4 stars out of 5. I like this headphone amplifier. In fact, I'm probably gonna leave this thing on my desk, and this will kind of be my neutral solid state reference. I'm gonna keep it alongside my Vali because the Vali does some special things, and I wanna keep it around. But yeah, it's a pretty good little amplifier. I think 200 bucks, not too bad. I know there's a lot of competition in this space, but not much to complain about here with the Drop. So if you're interested in checking this thing out, I do have a link in the description down below. While you're down there, if you found this video helpful, please hit the like button. It does actually help other people find this content. Subscribe to the channel, ding the bell, etc., etc., and then I'll see you on the next super review. Have a good night.